Hi up campers, Johnny Matthew here. Welcome back to the blog. This is one of the blog pods, so it's the short form read through of the text blog that you can read on Substack. If you want to read the text version, you can get it on Substack itself at johnnyvm.substack.com. Welcome. It's great to have you. If you're a returning visitor, thanks for coming back. If it's your first time, even better. Delightful to have you with us. If at any point any of you guys want to support the work financially, you can do it for a $5. Just nip over onto the text blog on Substack and click one of the blue buttons. Anyway, here we go. This one is called The Case for Abolishing Youth Custody, DTOs. Harmful, expensive, and criminogenic. Introduction. The very first paper to drop into my inbox in 2025 was this one from Kathy Hampson and Anne-Marie, and it's called The Case for Abolishing Youth Custody, Harmful, Expensive, and Criminogenic. I loved it. They are questioning why locking up children, saying that locking up children is a really bad idea and it needs radical change. So, as you can imagine, if you've been around my world for a while and you read any of the Troubled Kids stuff, you will know that this is right up my alley. So here we go. Why it's time to abolish detention and training orders in youth justice. Now, of course, this has an England and Wales bias in terms of the legislation and the stats and so forth. But of course, the principle stands that locking up kids, except in the most extreme circumstances, and in my view, only when it's the only option for effective help and rehabilitation and healing, we just shouldn't be doing it. So it applies across the piece, whatever jurisdiction you are in. So when children and young people come in contact with the criminal justice system, the focus should be on rehabilitation, support, and creating opportunities for positive change. Yet, in England and Wales, detention and training orders, or DTOs, remain a common sentencing option, despite mounting evidence that they're harmful, expensive, really expensive, and largely ineffective in reducing reoffending. So in this post, I'm using Kathy Hampson and Anne-Marie Day's paper to summarise the cause harmed by DTOs, suggest why they should be abolished, and to look at how youth justice and other practitioners can advocate for better alternatives. But firstly, the basics. What is a detention and training order? Well, DTOs are short custodial sentences given to children aged 12 to 17. They can last between 4 months and 2 years, with half the sentence served in custody and the other half in supervision in the community. They were introduced as part of the Crime and Disorder Act 1998 and were intended to combine detention with education and training to prepare young people for reintegration in society. So effectively, it's supposed to be for rehabilitation. However, the reality is far from this. Research has consistently shown that the educational and rehabilitative provisions during DTOs are inadequate, and the custodial experience often exacerbates the difficulties these kids face in the community rather than resolving them. The case against DTOs. As always, this is not an exhaustive treatment of the subject. Just some thoughts springing from Kathy and Anne-Marie's paper, and I suppose more than a few years of working in a very frustrating youth justice legislative framework. So the title of the paper gives away the essence of their argument, namely that DTOs are harmful, expensive, and criminogenic. So I'm just going to run through some of their arguments and then finish off making a few comments of my own, and this is some of it in terms of stats. Some of the stats flagrantly nicked from the paper, other ones I've looked into and researched independently, and there are quite a lot of links in the text blog. So if you want to nip over onto johnnyvm.substack.com, you can click through the links there if you want to follow up on any of the background information that informs this. All right, so I've got 5 major kind of points to make here about why we need to get rid of short-term custodial sentences for kids. Number 1, it's a breach of children's rights. United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, specifically Article 37, UNCRC, is clear. Detention of children should be used, quote, only as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time, unquote. Despite this, DTOs are frequently handed down for relatively minor offences, and many children remanded in custody do not go on to receive a custodial sentence at all. Just for those who maybe don't work in youth justice, when children are remanded in custody, they are sent to a secure setting prison, effectively, for the period between the kind of first court hearing or their arrest and the sentencing. And the idea really being that they shouldn't be remanded in custody unless there's a very high likelihood that the sentence will be a custodial sentence, in which case they can have the remand period deducted. But actually that tends not to happen. Lots of kids get remanded in custody and then don't get a custodial sentence, which begs the question, well, why were they in a custodial environment in the first place? Basically, that highlights a clear failure to apply the principle of last resort. Indeed, current sentencing arrangements allow for custody to be a first resort in the youth court if the offence is serious enough. Furthermore, children with neurodivergent conditions, special educational needs, and those from minority ethnic backgrounds are disproportionately affected by DTOs. While all children should have access to assessment of their capacity to participate in the court process, this rarely happens, and in my experience is often ridden roughshod over, even when requested by professionals. I've lost count the number of times I've said this child needs to be assessed for their capacity to participate, understand the process, give informed consent for things and so forth. And I could probably count on 2 hands the number of kids in 30 years or so where they've actually had that assessment. The system's not only failing to protect vulnerable children, it's actively compounding their disadvantages and, at times, flagrantly convening their rights. And a DTO is a classic, probably the archetypal example of that. So it's a breach of children's rights, number 1. Number 2, the moral argument. Children's brains are still developing, particularly in areas related to decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation, sometimes called the top-down or executive functions. These come on much later in adolescence and early emerging adulthood. So most kids, particularly those in the youth justice system who are often very disadvantaged and therefore have an impaired development, are not only chronologically nowhere near the maturity that a kind of ordinarily brought up child might be, but they are way behind the curve anyway because of the upbringing that they've had. So they tend sometimes they make poor decisions, or they may react reflexively without deciding anything at all and without fully understanding the consequences. DTOs fail to account for this developmental reality. Additionally, many children in the youth justice system have experienced significant trauma, neglect, and/or adverse childhood experiences. Placing these kids in punitive environments can deepen that trauma and lead to further behavioural difficulties. In my view, this is particularly the case where a child has suffered disrupted attachments. To then be cut off or detached, if you like, from everything familiar can further the damage and significantly limit the hope of rehabilitation, at least while they're inside. And I think it sets them back, even on re-entry into the community. For girls, the situation seems to be even more concerning. Though they represent only a small percentage of those in custody, the rates of self-harm and the use of force against girls in detention are disproportionately high. This, along with the earlier point about attachment, means that DTOs are not just failing, they're actively harming some of society's most vulnerable kids. There is, at this point, a graphic in the text blog over on Substack showing the number of children going into custody through the and also number of kids getting community sentences and the average length of sentence and so forth. I won't trouble you with those now because it's just lots of numbers. So it's a breach of children's rights. There is a moral argument in terms of development. Number 3, ineffectiveness in reducing reoffending. One of the primary goals of the youth justice system is to prevent reoffending. For the first time in 8 years, the overall reoffending rate has increased in the last year, though only by 0.9% to 32.2%. Now, that's the first time it's gone up since 2014. You can read that in the YJB stats and the links in the post. So the overall reoffending rate, that's right across the youth justice system. But for custody, the picture's bleaker still. In fact, it's much bleaker. At 70.3% reoffending rate for sentences under 12 months and 56.4% for sentences of 12 months to 4 years. 70% reoffending rate. So overall, kids leaving custody have some of the highest reoffending rates of any sentencing outcome, with nearly 60% reoffending within a year of release. So custody disrupts education, fractures family relationships, isolates children from some positive influences, and often induces negative, even traumatic effects. It also exposes them to environments where negative behaviours can be reinforced. In contrast, community sentences are being shown to be far more effective in addressing the root causes of offending and reducing reoffending. And of course, one of the arguments for getting rid of custodial sentences, not only that they don't work, but they're mega expensive. We'll see that in our next section. And if some of that money, even a fraction of it, was channeled through into youth justice teams who supervise kids in the community to enhance their portfolio of services, we could do a much better job of preventing reoffending. So in summary of point 3, effectiveness in reducing reoffending, short-term custody doesn't address reoffending effectively in children. It's practically useless in terms of rehabilitation. And in lots of cases, it makes the situation worse, not least around the mental health of the kids themselves. Number 4, financial cost. This is the doozy. Listen to some of these figures. Youth custody is staggeringly expensive. A place in a young offender institution, or a YOI, costs around £130,000 per child per year. Secure training centres and secure children's homes are even higher. They're much more child-friendly and humane environments, so the cost is necessarily higher. But despite these immense financial investment, the outcomes are still poor. So even though it's costing this much, it's not actually working. Community-based interventions, on the other hand, are not only more effective, but they also yield better results, both in terms of reducing offending and supporting positive child development, ergo reducing the likelihood of future reoffending. So according to figures from the MOJ, I got these from Hansard, the costs for children and young offenders are considerably higher. So there are 3 main custodial environments for kids: young offenders institutions, think prison, but just with children; a secure training centre, think bit less prison-like, but not quite home-like; and secure children's home, much more like a home, but with a big fence around it and bars on the windows. So they get increasingly better as we go down the list. So number one, of young offenders institution, 130 grand a year. That's 350 quid a day, or best part of 2.5 grand a week. It's madness. And then secure training centres, most expensive of the lot, 300 just shy of £306,000 per child per year. That's 840 quid a day, or just short of 5,900 quid a week. And secure children's homes are similar, just marginally less than that. So neither we, that is society, or the child and their family are getting any value for these staggering amounts of money that we expend when we're putting kids in custody, at least not on short-term sentences. Also, just to think what that kind of spend could do to support families in the community if it was routed to youth services, mental health and well-being, pupil referral units, youth justice teams, social services, adolescent teams, local voluntary sector, youth groups and community services. Man alive, you could transform prevention, reduce reoffending and save the country a pile of money if we just shifted where we spent it. And then lastly, number 5 and briefly, the notion of locking children up at all, but certainly short-term sentences like this, is a contradiction of the child first principles. So the Youth Justice Board's child first approach emphasises treating children as children, focusing on strengths, collaborative working and minimising stigma. Essentially, let's stop this nonsensical social construction of typical adolescent behaviour as flagrant law breaking and in need of punitive action. It's just spectacular bullshit, that. But it's out there in the ether and very difficult to shift. But DTOs are fundamentally at odds with those principles. They prioritise punishment over rehabilitation and reinforce the very stigma that the child first approach seeks to avoid. So even the youth justice system's overarching body has the right principles that the system itself is not set up to enforce. Quick break, and then we'll look at some alternatives to DTOs. All right, so what are some alternatives to detention and training orders? Well, the good news is that effective alternatives already exist. Youth rehabilitation orders, or YROs, this is a typical community sentence, like think probation order, but for a child. And there are options like intensive supervision and surveillance or intensive fostering. These things offer robust community-based responses to offending. So they're very wraparound, they're quite full on, they might be up to 24 hours direct one-to-one supervision a week and so forth. And these approaches allow kids to remain in their communities. They can maintain family connections, they can continue their education and receive tailored support from youth justice professionals. Now, countries like Sweden and Denmark and Japan have shown that it's possible to reserve custodial sentences only for the most serious offences, whilst prioritising community-based interventions for others. So what can youth justice practitioners do? We play a crucial, in my view, critical role in advocating for change and supporting children within the current system. So here's just, again, off the top of my head, a few things I think we can do. Advocate for legislative change. So speak up about the harms of DTOs. Push for policy reforms that align with child first principles. Raise these things in supervision. Raise them in social media posts. Respond to white papers, green papers, consultations. Writing letters to local MPs. Getting involved in consultation exercises and things like that can be fantastically advantageous. And because we work with kids, we know the system, we know their families and what happens and how these things can so negatively impact the work we're trying to do in the communities. We are brilliantly placed to articulate the need for change and also to agitate for specific, tried and tested alternatives. So advocate for legislative change. Promote community-based interventions. Work with the courts and local authorities to champion YROs and other community alternatives. Be creative, think outside the box, write articles, get the word out when something is working. Collaborate with other services, get involved with the local youth court, with the magistrates bench, with the prosecutors, with defence lawyers associations, inspectorates, things like that, to find ways of marshalling what resources there are to do a better job. And then we can put those forward as examples of good practice. So advocate for legislative change, promote community-based interventions, provide trauma-informed support. Talked quite a bit about this last week in the Children on the Margins #2 blog post, so I won't say a great deal here. You can look that one up, but recognise the trauma and vulnerabilities that many justice-involved children face and ensure that interventions are sensitive to those experiences. There's a ton we could say on that, but I know you guys are up to speed on that and will know what I mean. So provide trauma-informed support wherever you can. That principally is relationships with empathic, caring, intelligent professional people like you and I. Build strong relationships. Build trust with children and families, focusing on strengths rather than on deficits. Trust is a conduit over which change can travel. So let's be consistent, build trust, and make that a focus. Once we get to that point, very often children and families will begin to offer us their uniquely insightful ideas about how things could go better, be better, and how they could do better. But relationship is often the prerequisite for that. And then lastly, collaborate across services. Mentioned that already in an aside just now, but working closely with education, health, social services, youth work, housing, schools, sixth form colleges, pupil referral units, fostering organisations, specialist residential, childcare providers, and so forth can make a huge difference if we're all on the same page. So there's a few ideas. Final thoughts. DTOs, in my view, are a relic of a punitive youth justice approach that has long been discredited. They fail to respect children's rights, they exacerbate vulnerabilities, cost enormous amounts of money, and do very little to reduce offending. By abolishing DTOs and investing in community-based interventions, we can create a system that truly prioritises the welfare, rights and prospects of children who come in conflict with the law. For youth justice practitioners, policymakers and advocates, the call to action, in my view anyway, and certainly the view of Kathy Hampson and Anne-Marie Day, is really clear. It's time to move beyond DTOs, full stop in my view, but absolutely definitely short-term DTOs, and build a system rooted in care, compassion, and what we know works. So let's ensure custody is truly a measure of last resort, not a default response. If I had my way, I'd get rid of it altogether. As I say, there are tons of links in the blog itself over on Substack, so please check those out if you want to deep dive into this more. In the meantime, thanks again for being here, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers, guys.